we know the story. On September 11, 1777, two massive armies collided in the quiet Chester County countryside, 25 miles west of Philadelphia. General George Washington had positioned his Continental Army between the rebel capital and the advancing British troops under the command of General William Howe. The subsequent battle along the Brandywine Creek is considered one of the largest battles of the American Revolution, and it has rightfully received copious research attention by military and local historians alike. But one mystery remains suspiciously absent from most, if not all, accounts of the Battle of Brandywine, and that is biographical information on Jesse Graves, the man whose land was the epicenter of this major military engagement, the man whose land later became known as Birmingham Hill. Birmingham Hill witnessed some of the fiercest fighting that September day of 1777. It is where the three Continental divisions under Generals John Sullivan, Alexander Sterling, and Adam Stevens hastily formed to counter General Howe's crafty flanking maneuver, which he hoped would catch the Continental troops off guard. It is where the young 19-year-old Marquis de Lafayette suffered a musketball wound to his leg in his first combat experience of the American Revolution. And Birmingham Hill is where a steadfast American line repelled multiple British bayonet attacks. It was only the final British push that finally broke through and dispersed the remaining Continentals in confusion. But what if we peel back the layers and look beyond the immediate military activities of that day? When we do that, we see land owned by a family whose lives were forever changed by the events of that day. But little has been written about this Quaker family, which consisted of Jesse Graves, his wife, Elizabeth Lloyd, and their children, Susanna, Jehu, Tacey, and Hannah. So that begs the question, what do we know about this Chester County family and the property they owned, which became the epicenter of this massive battle? In 1777, Birmingham Township was home to some of Chester County's more well-known names, like the Britons, Darlingtons, Chadds, Gilpins, and Pennocks. Many of these families even remained in the area for generations. The Graves family, on the other hand, arrived on the scene in March 1776, but by the mid-1780s, they had relocated to Kennett Township, and they had seemingly moved from Chester County entirely by 1790. They left little evidence behind during their short residency in Chester County, just a few land records and taxes, accompanied by the Quaker minutes from the various meetings they had attended. The scarce paper trail left behind by Jesse Graves and his family invokes more questions than it provides answers. So let's start with what we know. In March 1776, Jesse Graves purchased 184 acres of land situated in Birmingham Township from David Britton. The deed which recorded this transaction provides some clues into the identity of Graves. It identifies him as residing in Lower Marion Township, Philadelphia County at the time of the transaction. It also lists his occupation as a yeoman, meaning his main source of income was tied to his land. But this is where we're introduced to the first mystery. According to this 1776 deed, we're led to believe Jesse Graves simply purchased land with no dwelling house situated on it. It was a common method in Chester County deeds to use the term messuage to denote a dwelling house on a property. Because this deed simply reads, all that tract or parcel of land, no mention of a messuage, we're logically going to assume Jesse Graves bought land. That's it. But this doesn't quite add up. Here's why. First, David Britton was the owner who sold Graves the 184-acre property. And in 1775, so 1 year before the transaction, Britton was taxed for 180 acres and buildings. Buildings is an ambiguous term here because the local tax assessor used it to describe everything from a skimpy frame barn all the way to a grand two-story stone dwelling house. Based on this 1775 tax assessment, as well as the first tax assessment for Jesse Graves in 1778, which also signifies buildings, we know there were buildings on the property, but whether or not that was a dwelling house is immediately unknown. But let's dig a little deeper. On July 3rd, 1776, Jesse Graves produced a certificate to transfer his family from the Radnor Meeting House, which they likely attended while living in Lower Marion, to the Birmingham Friends Meeting House, which was located directly adjacent to his new 184-acre property he bought 4 months earlier from David Britton. The obvious question then becomes, if there was no dwelling house on this property, which is implied in the March 1776 deed, Why would he have relocated himself, his wife, and 3 young kids to the neighboring meeting house? It's unlikely he constructed a new dwelling house in the short span of a few months, so that begs the question, was the original deed from March 1776 wrong? It's important to remember, just like today, clerical errors did happen. While it was a common practice to include the word messuage when a dwelling place existed on a property, it was certainly not a foolproof method. But perhaps the biggest indicator to suggest there was, in fact, a dwelling house on this property when Jesse Graves originally purchased it comes years later in 1782. You see, in 1782, the war was winding down, and delegates from the American colonies, France, Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands all met in Paris to negotiate peace conditions. To strengthen the American position and provide leverage for better terms, many state legislatures, including Pennsylvania, compiled a register of accounts from residents who had their property seized or destroyed without compensation by the British Army. Jesse Graves, whose land witnessed so much of the fighting during the Battle of Brandywine, submitted one of these accounts to report stolen property and damages caused back in September 1777. The account submitted by Graves in 1782 is extensive to say the least. It includes some typical, everyday items for an 18th century family, like farm animals, various crops, equipment, tools, and other household items. These items suggest the Graves were in fact residing on this property when the British marched through, as opposed to leasing it out or simply cultivating the land. What's even more revealing about this account of damages, however, is the quantity of items being reported as stolen. 17 shirts, 3 petticoats, 9 white aprons, 11 women's capes, 12 pairs of stockings, 100 pounds of lard, 20 gallons of soap. The list goes on. The quantity of items and the value of this account were certainly unusual for a typical Chester County family of the day. It suggests not only were the Graves residing on the property when the battle unfolded, but it also raises a question about their livelihood. It begs the question, was Jesse Graves running a general store from this property when the British marched through in September 1777? It was typical for local tax assessors to identify an individual's occupation if it was something other than a farmer. Occupations like a general laborer, miller, innkeeper, tavern keeper, blacksmith, weaver, carpenter, cordwainer, or a shopkeeper were usually spelled out in the tax records. But at no time between 1776, when he first purchased the property, through 1788, when he is last taxed in Birmingham Township, is Jesse Graves identified as a shopkeeper. But what else would explain this huge inventory? What is also potentially revealing is that in 1873, so 100 years later, Alban Seal is identified on a map as owning a general store at the very intersection once owned by Jesse Graves. This shows us that the intersection was quite desirable. If Alban Seal realized this intersection had business potential in the 19th century, Jesse Graves likely did too during his time in Birmingham Township. It is very likely Jesse Graves purchased the 184 acres from David Britton with the intention of starting a general store. You see, Graves purchased the property for Britton and then immediately took out a mortgage on it. This implied Graves wanted the prime location of the real estate, which was situated at the intersection of 2 well-traveled roads, yet he also needed the cash. Why did he need the cash? Well, he likely needed to purchase an inventory for the business he wanted to start. So he took out a mortgage and eventually bought those 17 shirts, 12 stockings, 100 pounds of lard, and 20 gallons of soap. Little did Jesse Graves know, in September 1777, the British Army would plunder his newly acquired inventory, thus denying him the dream he had of operating a general store. Therefore, it makes sense why Graves was never taxed for being a shopkeeper, because he never had the opportunity to officially start his business. By the time the British marched through, he was still preparing to open. Of course, this is all speculation, since to our knowledge, there is no record that clearly identifies Jesse Graves as a shopkeeper. But what is certain is beginning in 1783, he slowly started to relocate his family once again. In March 1783, Jesse Graves sold about 60 acres of his property to William Dilworth. The deed indicates there was no dwelling house situated on this 60-acre plot. The 1783 tax assessment, however, recorded only a few months later, raises questions since William Dilworth was taxed for his newly acquired 61 acres and a dwelling house. Was Dilworth able to construct a new house in a few short months? A more likely scenario is the dwelling house Dilworth was taxed for in June 1783 was actually the general store Jesse Graves had intended to open. Why was this the likely store location? Well, for one, because it conveniently sat at the intersection of two roads, one of the roads being a great road leading to nearby Dilworth Town and eventually Wilmington. This was the same location Alban Seale later utilized for his general store in the 19th century. And two, because Jesse Graves was also taxed in June 1783. This time, he was only taxed for 100 acres as well as a dwelling house. It's important to consider the tough financial situation this family found themselves in by 1783. As we have just hypothesized, Graves likely invested so much of his money into this new business, including a large inventory to stock the shelves, and perhaps even materials to construct a new building. When the British plundered the property, Graves was left with little material goods but a growing debt because he had a mortgage to pay. In 1783, Graves likely sold this 60-acre tract to recoup some of his lost income. Since the Graves were still residing on this Birmingham Township property in June 1783, we can speculate the main dwelling house was situated on the larger remaining tract. The next land transaction involving Jesse Graves and his Birmingham Township property occurred in March 1785, 2 years later after his first real estate division. In March 1785, Jesse Graves sold 100 acres of land to Isaac Garrett. The Graves' main dwelling house was likely situated on this tract, despite the fact the deed still mentioned no messuage. The legal language for this deed was likely repurposed from the 1776 deed from back when Graves originally purchased the larger 184-acre property from David Britton. But there's enough evidence to suggest this 100-acre plot is where the Graves physically resided during the Battle of Brandywine. After Jesse Graves sold both the 100-acre tract to Isaac Garrett, as well as the 60-acre tract to William Dilworth, he still owned about 12 acres from his original 184-acre plot. This smaller plot was located to the east of the Birmingham Road. In 1785, Graves was taxed for 12 acres in Birmingham Township. Interestingly, however, he was not taxed for buildings, thus implying this was simply a plot of land that Graves held onto. The man he just sold land to, however, Isaac Garrett, was taxed for 100 acres and buildings. These buildings likely included the dwelling house formerly owned by the Graves family. If Jesse Graves owned just land in Birmingham Township by 1785, however, the obvious question then becomes, where was the family residing? At the same time Graves was taxed for 12 acres in Birmingham Township, he was also taxed in Kennet Township as an inmate. Inmate was a term used to denote a married or widowed man older than 21 with no taxable property. Most inmates would have resided in a small cottage or tenant house situated on someone else's larger plantation. So by June 1785, we know the Graves family was residing in Kennet Township based on this tax record. But we also know they were removed from the Birmingham Meeting House and admitted to the New Garden Meeting House, which was situated right outside Kennet Township. What is particularly interesting about this entry in the Quaker meeting minutes is it lists the members of the Graves family as Jesse, Elizabeth, Jehu, Tacey, and Hannah. Hannah, we can presume, was born after 1776, but before 1783. What is interesting is its omission of the oldest daughter, Susanna, thus implying she was no longer a member of the immediate Graves family. Further research reveals in June 1784, Susanna married John Pyle of Kennet Township. It's interesting to consider whether Susanna's marriage to a Kennet Township man attracted the rest of her family to the area, or whether her family's move to the area first introduced her to her future husband, John Pyle. Regardless, we know that by the summer of 1785, 8 years after their property was destroyed by the British Army, the Graves family no longer resided in Birmingham Township. They continued to be taxed for the 12 acres, however, until April 1787, when Jesse Graves, now identified as residing in Kennet, sold those 12 acres to William Seale. Interestingly enough, however, Graves still held on to an even smaller 2-acre plot in Birmingham Township until October 1789, when he sold the remaining piece of his once 184-acre property to the same William Seale. 1789 is the final year Jesse Graves appears in the Chester County tax records. In October 1789, the New Garden Meeting House indicated they prepared a certificate to have Jesse, Elizabeth, and their two youngest daughters, Tacy and Hannah, removed. This implies the Graves were on the move once again. In fact, in the 1789 Kennett Township tax assessment, Jesse Graves' name is crossed out, which is fittingly symbolic. There are so many unanswered questions that still surround this forgotten family, yet with a bit more research, perhaps a clearer picture will soon emerge. They called Birmingham Township home for nearly a decade, and when we string together the bits and pieces of evidence they left behind, we clearly see a young family enter Birmingham Township with a lot of property and leave with very little. There's one major event which occurred in between these two flashpoints, and that was the Battle of Brandywine. While this family has received little attention, their backyard, commonly referred to as Birmingham Hill, has enjoyed the spotlight. The story of the Graves family and their Birmingham Township property is quite symbolic of Chester County as a whole. Much of our attention immediately gets drawn to the action and drama which unfolded between the two massive armies and the politics behind all the fighting. Yet caught in the middle were real people, real stories, and real lives. Their perspective and their memories of the battle might not have been recorded in diaries or war journals for future posterity, but they are every bit just as authentic. The Graves were just a single family impacted by this momentous event. When the British Army crossed into Pennsylvania on September 9, 1777, en route to Philadelphia, an entire county stood in their path. An entire county populated by families just like the Graves.